Good evening and welcome to Nelson Hall for our very first live stream event. There are few topics more interesting to those who love the history of Scotland and Great Britain than the Jacobite Risings. We are very happy to invite folk singer, songwriter, and lover of history, Charlie Zahm, to present his popular one-man show entitled The Jacobite Risings in Song and Story this evening. In this program, Charlie takes on the persona of a real-life Jacobite, Sir John Macdonald, who was with Prince Charles Edward Stuart from the moment he left France in 1745 until the bitter end at Culloden the following year. Please join me as we welcome Charlie Zahm back to Nelson Hall. We hope you enjoy the story of the Jacobite Risings.
A sword in my scabbard, I've a targe upon my back, and a cockade on my bonnet. I will go, I will go, I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left, to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. Well, the king's son came along, called us together, saying, "Fine Highland men, you will fight for my father." I will go, I will go, I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. It was early in the day, the lassies were singing, but the tears came to their eyes when the bells started ringing. I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. Then we saw Culloden Moor. There was snow on the heather. We knew that some would fall and would lie there forever. I will go, I will go. I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. When we came back to the glen, the winter was turning, our goods lay in the snow, and our houses were burning. I will go, I will go. I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. When the fighting is over, to the land, oh MacLeod, that I left to be a soldier. I will go, I will go. I will go, I will go. I will go, I will go.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce myself. The name is John MacDonald. Sir John MacDonald, at your service. And it's very nice to be back at Nelson Hall, here at Elam Park, at the invitation of the bonny wee lassie, Rochelle Podrignelli. Podrignelli is a very beautiful Scottish name, if you weren't aware of that. And I know you're not actually here today. I come to you through the magic of live stream, a term I had never heard before until today. The only streams I'm aware of have fish in them swimming, and there's rocks and there's water coming down from the mountainside. But I understand that live streaming brings me into your living room this very evening. So for the next little while, I want you to relax and sit back And let me take you back from your day here in your century to the days of my day in the mid-18th century. I fought for bonny Prince Charlie. You might have heard of Charles Edward Stuart. You might have heard of the Jacobite Risings. If you've heard of any battles at all having to do with the Jacobite Risings, it was probably Culloden, which Culloden's a wind-blasted moor to the east of Inverness, way up in the Highlands. And bonny Prince Charlie fought to win back his father's throne for his father, James VIII of Scotland, James III of England. But the story of the Jacobites goes long before the time of the bonny prince. And for the next little while, with your kind permission, I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. Now, I actually came in contact with the bonny prince shortly before we sailed from the coast of France in 1745. July of that year, landed on the coast of Scotland just a couple of weeks later. I come from Ireland myself, but I'm of Scottish extraction, most recently in the service of His Most Christian Majesty, the King of France, as well as James VIII of Scotland, the Third of England. Those who love him call him their King James. Those who don't care for him at all call him the old pretender to the throne. But regardless of where you may lie on either side of the politics of the mid-18th century, I asked for the next little while for you to walk with me, along with the bonny prince and the other Jacobites, as we rise. I ask for you, wherever you are, in your homes, on your couches, on your chairs, to rise for the bonny prince. Rise, rise, Lowland and Highland men, bold sire, fearless son, each commander he. Rise, rise, mainland and island men, belt on your broadsword, wait for Prince Charlie. Men of the mountains, descendants of heroes, heirs of the fame and the hills of your fathers. Stay shall the Sassenach, Southern not fear us, when fierce the war pipe and lated clan gather. Rise, rise, Lowland and Highland men, old sire, fearless son, each commander he. Rise, rise, mainland and island men, bells on your broadsword, wait for Prince Charlie. Down from the mountain steep, up from the valley deep, out from the Clachan, the Bothy and Sheeling. Bugle and battle drum, mid chief and vessel come loudly, the war pipe and pibroch are pealing. Rise, rise, Lowland and Highland men, bold sire, fearless son, each commander he. Rise, rise, mainland and island men, belt on your broadsword, fight for Prince Charlie. When hath the tarted plaid mantled a coward? When did the bonnet blue crest the despoil? Come then and crowd to the standard of Stuarts, follow your hero, the rightful, the royal. Come chief of Clan Ranald and Ellen's MacDonald, come Lovett, Lockheil and the Grants and the Gordon. Come every Hieland clan, come every royal man, musket on shoulder, by the broadsword on. Rise, rise, Lowland and Highland and bold sire, fearless son, each commander he. Rise, rise, mainland and island men, belt on your broadsword, fight for Prince Charlie. Rise, rise, Lowland and Highland men, bold sire, fearless son, each commander lee. Rise, rise, mainland and island men, belts on your broadsword, fight for Prince Charlie. Fight for Prince Charlie. Fight for Prince Charlie. That's right, for the next little while I ask for you to rise with me as I take you along the stories of the Jacobite Risings. I've got to take you back to 1688. In fact, a little bit before that. In 1688, King James VII of Scotland, the second of England, was deposed by his nephew, who was married also to his daughter. But I've got to take you a little bit back before that, to 1685. In 1685, James's older brother Charles II, died. Now, Charles was a good Anglican right up until his deathbed. On his deathbed, he actually had a conversion, so to speak, to Catholicism, because we didn't know at the time, but he had been taking money from France to one day declare himself a Catholic. Back in those days, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, religion was everything. Or if not that, it was most things anyway. Charles knew that he could not rule his country of England and Scotland and also Ireland, the three kingdoms, if he declared himself a Catholic. So he didn't until almost before he died. And when he died in 1685, his younger brother James VII of Scotland, the second of England, assumed the throne. But unlike Charles, James was not a very good politician, not at all. Also, he didn't have any scruples of keeping his Catholicism private. Because you see, since the time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth after that, England had become more and more Protestant. Europe changed and changed greatly. England was no longer a Catholic nation, but James was a very staunch Catholic, and he didn't take any of that. So when he got to the throne, he declared himself a Catholic, and he started removing men from their various places in government who were Protestant and replacing them with Catholic men. By his very first marriage, he had two daughters. He had Mary and he had Anne. His first wife was named Anne. Anne Hyde was her name. And he became more and more Catholic. And when Anne passed away, he had raised his two daughters as good Anglicans, just as his brother Charles had demanded he was king. He didn't say no to the king about such things in those days. But then he got married again to an Italian princess whose name was Mary of Modena. She was very much a Catholic. And all things were okay for a while because they only had two daughters, Mary and Anne, both of whom were good Anglicans. And as James was getting up in years, when he passed on, certainly his throne would open up for one of his two daughters and their husbands as good Anglicans. The only thing was, James and his new wife, Mary of Modena, had a son, and they baptized him a Catholic. And that gave England a real scare, because back in those days, the suspicion was that the son, no matter how old he was, became the next in line to the throne, and the girls, his sisters, were pushed back behind him. That made several men in England very upset. 7, who were later called the 7 Immortals, wrote a letter to James's nephew, who was also his son-in-law, William of Orange, a Dutch prince from the Netherlands, and invited him to come over and assume the throne. And his wife Mary would be a queen, along with him being a king. Well, it didn't take William very long to have to think about that. Let's see, I could live in Holland with the tulips, or I could have England as my kingdom. He made up his mind pretty quickly. And with a rather large army in November of 1688, he made his way over to the southwest of England and made his way up to London. James had a real scare. He threw the Great Seal into the Thames and he fled into the arms of his cousin, the King of France, Louis XIV, who welcomed him in. But Louis didn't give him very long to stay. Now, James had gone over the Channel into France where it was safe and his head was secure on his shoulders. But many Scots were not at all happy that a Stuart had abdicated the throne. One of them in particular was named James Graham. If you didn't like him, you called him Bloody Clavers, because what he did to the Covenanters. But if you did like him, you called him Bonnie Dundee. And while the English Parliament declared that William and Mary were their new joint sovereigns, it was not so easy north of the border into Scotland. And James Graham, Bonnie Dundee, tried to effect change in the Convention Parliament, the Convention of Estates. But he was outnumbered greatly, and the Scots, just like their English cousins to the south, decided to bring in William and Mary. And bonny Dundee got on his horse, and he rode out the west port, and many people along the Royal Mile waved their caps and their hats in the air, and they said, "Up with the bonnets, O bonny Dundee."
Say the lairds a convention, 'twas Claverhouse spoke. Ere the king's crown go down, there'll be crowns to be broke. Then let each cavalier who loves honour and me come follow the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my horses and call out my men. Unhook the Westport and let us gae free, for it's up wi' the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. Dundee is mounted, he rides up the street. The bells they ring backward, the drums they are beat. But the provost man just says he let him be. The tune is well read, but a deal of Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my horses, call out my men. Unhook the Westport and let us gae free, for it's up wi' the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. There are hills beyond Pentland and lands beyond Forth. If there are lairds in the south, there are chiefs in the north. There are brave Dooney Wassels, 3,000 times 3, who cry high for the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my horses, call out my men. Unhook the Westport and let us gae free, for it's up wi' the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. Then no war, tae the hills, tae the lee, tae the rocks. There I know the usurper, I'll couch wi' the fox. Then tremble, false wigs, in the midst of your glee. Ye hae no seen the last of my bonnets and me. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my horses, call out my men. Unhook the Westport and let us gae free, for it's up wi' the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, saddle my horses, call out my men. Unhook the Westport and let us gae free, for it's up wi' the bonnets, O bonny Dundee. So James Graham made his way up to the Highlands of Scotland, and he decided to make a stand. He was a man who did what he believed in. And while his king was in exile, more or less self-imposed exile, I suppose, he decided to raise the Highland clans who wanted a Stuart back on the throne. After all, the Stuarts can trace their lines all the way back to the days of Robert the Bruce. Why wouldn't they want a Stuart who had ruled Scotland for so many generations back on their throne over all of them? Back in those days, of course, the king who sat in London ruled 3 kingdoms, Scotland and England and Ireland. But they wanted James to at least come back and be the ruler of Scotland. At that time, there were 2 separate kingdoms, England for Scotland. So he raised the Highland clans up at a place called Killiecrankie, way up in the Highlands of Scotland. And he was a great general. He roused the troops, and they had a tactic that you might have heard of before. And by the way, I'm not sure how many of you might have Scottish heritage in you, but chances are, if you've got some Scottish blood in you, you might have come over, your people might have come over right after the time of the Jacobite Risings that we're singing and talking about this evening, because so many came to what was to become North and South Carolina. Many went to Canada as well, up and down the eastern seaboard of the colonies. So the Jacobites came as they were thrown in prisons, thrown on ships, and brought here. So if you recognize some of these stories, perhaps your mammy or your pappy were to sing them for you
when you were a wee lass or a wee laddie, and hopefully they're coming back to you now. But if you're from Scotland and you're listening to me now, you certainly know the tune of Killiecrankie. It's about James Graham, Bonnie Dundee, and there he was leading his troops in the great Highland charge. If you don't know what a Highland charge is, I'll explain it to you. The Highlanders had basically one tactic, and they were not a regular army like for instance, England had an army of a regular chain of command. In the Highlands of Scotland, where the clan system offered up various armies to James VII, and James VIII, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, they were all from the clan system. Clan simply means family. So when Bonnie Dundee went to the Highlands of his own native Scotland, and he asked the Highland clans to create a great army for him, the clans were under various divisions, all underneath a clan chief. And the clan chief was the ultimate arbiter of anything that happened in his clan. He was the judge, and he was the jury, he was the police, he was more or less their king. And in the Highlands, way in the remote parts of Scotland, and you have to understand, back in 1689, which is where we are now, there are very few roads in Scotland. If you go to Scotland today and you travel across some roads way up in the Highlands, none of those were there in 1689. It was a very agrarian society, and there were very few roads to speak of except for the cattle trails, where the Highlanders would take their cattle south to the lowlands of Scotland for sale. The trails were there, but there were no roads to speak of. So when General Mackay came up with his government troops, all in their red coats and their buttons and their buckles on their shoes, they were not used to the rugged mountainous climbs that the Highlanders were used to. So at Killiecrankie, the Highlanders made sure they were above their enemy, because the Highland charge that I'm about to tell you about now relied on a distance and an elevation. And many of the Highlanders had muskets. Many of them were old and rusty, but many of them worked. And when the charge was given by Bonnie Dundee, followed by all the clan chiefs, the clansmen charged down the mountainside. They fired their guns about 50 paces from their enemy, threw their gun into the dirt, and then ran with their broadsword, hacking and slashing and hacking and slashing, and gravity was on their side as they made their way down, hacked and slashed until there was nothing left to hack and slash. And that was the Battle of Killiecrankie. And it was won. It was won by the Highlanders. Won for the Highlanders. Unfortunately, their great leader, Bonnie Dundee, James Graham, was shot through the breastplate, and he died. But as he died, and as his blood was flowing out of his body, he watched his own men declare victory, and he died there on the field.
Where hae ye been, sae braw lad? Where hae ye been, sae brankie ho? Where hae ye been, sae braw lad? Come ye by Killiecrankie ho? I and ye had been where I hae been. You wouldn't have been sae canty ho. I and ye had seen what I hae seen on the braes o' Killiecrankie ho. Well, I fought at land, I fought at sea, at Tame I fought by Auntie ho. But I met the devil and Dundee on the braes o' Killiecrankie ho. I and ye had been where I hae been. You wouldn't have been sae canty ho. I and ye had seen what I had seen on the braes o' Killiecrankie ho. Well, the bald pit core fell in a four, and Craver's got a clanky ho. Or had I fed on Athol lad on the braes o' Killiecrankie ho. I and he had seen what I had seen. You wouldn't have been sae canty ho. I and he had been where I had been on the braes o' Killiecrankie ho. On the braes
story of Killiecrankie. It happened July 27th, 1689, and it was a decisive victory for the forces of King James VII of Scotland, King James II of England. But as I mentioned, their great leader, Bonnie Dundee, was shot to death in the middle of the action. He only lived long enough to see that it was actually a victory, and then he passed on. The Highland chiefs and the Highland clans with them sort of went back into their rocks, their fastnesses where they lived. And there was another battle, but for all intents and purposes, with Bonnie Dundee, there was no more rising there in 1689. So William and Mary assumed the throne, but James still had one more trick up his sleeve. Louis XIV of France, who had taken in his cousin James, back in those days, all of Europe were all cousins. All the kings and queens, they were all related to each other. And King Louis said, you know, James, if you're going to get your throne back, you've got to go back to England, and you've got to get it back. I know it didn't work out for you in Scotland, but you've got to get back to England, maybe via the back door. Now, the back door to England in those days was Ireland. So James made his way all the way on the other side of what were known as the British Isles, and he landed in Ireland. And the Irish rose for him, and there were a few battles, but they were all decisive victories on the part of William, especially the Battle of the Boyne. And with the Battle of the Boyne, that was it. There were no more battles fought in the Jacobite Rising of 1688 to 1689, and thus began the Glorious Revolution. It's called the Glorious Revolution because there were no shots fired in anger in England as the throne passed from one man to another, and the first man didn't want to give it up, but the second man took it without a shot being fired in England. So it was glorious. It wasn't so glorious in Scotland or especially in Ireland, but it's known as the Glorious Revolution. And William and Mary were there ensconced on the throne of England and Scotland and Ireland. And I believe you might have heard their names before. You've got a colony, I believe, called Virginia, do you not? I think there's a college down there called William and Mary College. And if you ever wonder where William and Mary College comes from, it's from William and Mary, who assumed the throne in 1688 to 1689. Now, Mary was to die, I believe it was 1694, and William was to live until 1702. James VII passed away in 1701. What I've got to tell you about William and his relationship with the Scots, he didn't much care for the Scots. After all, they all didn't declare for him when he said he had come over to be king. In fact, as you know, many of them rose against him, fired against his troops, led under General Mackay right up there in the Highlands of Scotland. So he didn't care for the Scots, but he especially didn't trust the Highlanders. So on the very last stroke of the clock in the year 1691, he had sent out a decree that all the Highland clans had to swear allegiance to him by the last stroke of midnight of that year, 1691. And if they didn't declare for him, saying they would never rise against him again, and they also declared that he was the rightful sovereign, fire and sword was surely to follow. Well, all the Highland clans sweared on time, save one. And that was old Alistair MacIan of the Glencoe MacDonalds. If you've ever been to Glencoe before, in your day, it's a popular mountain climbing destination. The cliffs are very sheer and very steep. There's always a mist rolling across the glen of Glencoe. And it's a beautiful, spectacular place, but you swear as you enter into it, you're going into some nether world. It's very dark. The rains come. All of a sudden, there's sunlight, and the rains come back again. That's where the MacDonalds of Glencoe lived. But old Alistair MacIan, who was a bear of a man at about 6'6", he wrote a letter to his sovereign, James VII of Scotland, and asked James for permission to swear allegiance to this new king. Now, James was not going to hold back permission for that, especially asked in such an honourable fashion. So finally, MacIan, old Alistair, got his permission to swear allegiance. Now, you could only swear allegiance in a couple of places, and Alistair was late. He didn't swear on time, and he was delayed by snow. He was even kind of imprisoned for one evening. But he eventually made it to where it was. About 5 days late, he should swear allegiance to his new king, William. But he did it too late, and that was noted. Down in London, there were certain politicians who wanted to make an example of this wayward Jacobite clan. And that gentleman had papers written up to be signed by the king that the Glencoe MacDonalds were to be extirpated. They used that word, extirpated, root and branch, by fire and sword. This was to teach the MacDonalds a lesson, as well as any other Highland clan that dared to not follow the orders, the edicts of their new king. So there was a Campbell militia sent up there, an Argyll militia. And the Campbells and the MacDonalds had never gotten along particularly well. And old Robert Campbell of Glenlyon had a bone to pick with old Alistair MacIan. Back in those days, the clans were always fighting against each other. They were poor and impoverished. They would steal cattle one day over here, and their cattle would be stolen the other day over there, and vice versa. And so it went in the clan warfare that was very much a part of the culture in the Highlands of Scotland. You have here in your colonies as well. You might have heard of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Well, those were Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish, I'm going a bit far afield now, but I want to explain to you. The Scots-Irish came over from Scotland to Ireland, and then from Ireland to your colonies. And they carried their clan warfares with them. And these clan warfares, like the Hatfields and the McCoys, would carry on for generations. And these feuds were handed down like property from father to son. You can carry on my feud for me now. And so it was with the Hatfields and the McCoys. And the Campbells and the MacDonalds were no different. That's where all these feuds came from. So, old Robert Campbell of Glenlyon took his Argyll militia up to the MacDonalds of Glencoe. They didn't say they came in anything but peace. After all, these Argyll militia, the independent companies, would patrol around the Highlands of Scotland from time to time to try to keep the peace for the king. And the MacDonalds knew that they had sworn allegiance. They should have been on the right side of the law. Robert Lyon knew something was different. Eventually, orders came for a 5 a.m. raid that everybody under the age of 70 was to fall to the sword or to the musket or to the bayonet. February 13th, 1692. Now understand, if you can, for a moment. The Argyll militia was taken into the village of Glencoe. They were quartered amongst the villagers. They ate dinner with them. They said their prayers with them. They went to sleep side by side. The Argyll militia did with the MacDonalds of Glencoe. The MacDonalds felt they had forged friendships with their new companions, who had been there for almost 2 weeks by that time. But the orders from the king were not to be ignored. Robert Campbell of Glenlyon knew that he had a duty to fulfill. So at 5 a.m., all of the Argyll militia stood up in their cottages amongst the various MacDonalds who were still asleep, and they started firing into the faces, into the backs of those who had taken them in from a snowstorm. In those days, Highland hospitality was everything. When the Campbells came in February, the snowstorms were right and left and center. They were everywhere. The Argyll militia would not survive were it not for the MacDonalds who took them in. So, when the Campbells started firing on their hosts, killing them, and in fact, old Alistair MacIan was shot in the face and in the back, and his wife was killed right after him. It was a bit of a chapter in Highland history that will remain in the race memory of the Highland Scots forever, and it became known as the Massacre of Glencoe.
Cruel is the snow that sweeps Glencoe and covers the grave of Donald, and cruel was the foe that raped Glencoe and murdered the Hughes of MacDonald. They came in a blizzard, we offered them heat, a roof for their heats, dry shoes for their feet. We wined them, we dined them, they ate of our meat, and slept in the house o' MacDonald. Cool is the snow that sweeps Glencoe and covers the grave of Donald. Cool was the foe that raped Glencoe and murdered the hoose o' MacDonald. They came in the night when the men were asleep, this band of Argyles, through snow soft and deep, like murdering foxes among helpless sheep. They slaughtered the hoose o' MacDonald. Cool is the snow that sweeps Glencoe and covers the grave of Donald. Cool was the foe that raped Glencoe and murdered the hoose o' MacDonald. They came from Fort William with murder in mind. The Campbell had orders King William had signed, and all to the sword, and these words underlined: leave none alive called MacDonald. Cool is the snow that sweeps Glencoe and covers the grave of Donald. Cool was the foe that raped Glencoe and murdered the hoose o' MacDonald. Some died in their beds at the hands of the foe. Some fled in the night and were lost in the snow. Some lived to accuse him who struck the first blow. Oh, but gone is the hoose o' MacDonald. Cool is the snow that sweeps Glencoe and covers the grave of Donald. Cool was the foe that raped Glencoe and murdered the hoose o' MacDonald. Yes, gone is the hoose o' MacDonald.
And to this very day, if you go up to Scotland, they'll still talk about the massacre of Glencoe. They'll still talk, somewhat tongue-in-cheek now, about the clan feuds between the MacDonalds and the Campbells. But I can tell you this, if you go to a Highland Games somewhere along in your American colonies and they have the clan parade at the end, chances are very good they will put the MacDonalds on one side of the line and the Campbells way over on the other. So this takes us now to the next generation of Jacobite Risings. I'm hoping you're having a good time wherever you are through the miracle of your stream. You might remember that in 1688, the month was June. Just a few days ago, in fact, as we are here in June in your time, James gave birth to a son, later known as James VIII of Scotland, James III of England. And after his father had passed away in 1701, he became the recognized heir apparent to the throne, or recognized rather heir to the throne, except he didn't have a throne to sit on, and he didn't have a crown to put on his head, because back in jolly old England, other people were wearing those. Now, after William of Orange passed away in 1702, there had been laws passed to prevent any Catholic. Again, they remembered James VII, a rather imperious gentleman. They remember his ways, and they didn't want another Catholic sitting on the throne of England. So they passed laws that no one could be king of England and be a Catholic at the same time, nor could a king of England marry a Catholic. So James, over there in exile in France, was somewhat sidelined. And he looked across the channel and he saw his half-sister, Anne. You might remember Anne. There was Mary and there was Anne, the two daughters of James by his first marriage to Anne Hyde. And Mary was then on the throne from the time of William's death all the way until 1714. But James was not going to wait until 1714 to raise his cap once again. In fact, there was the great union of the thrones, union of the crowns, in 1707. Now, that's a glamorous way of saying that the Scots politicians were bought and sold with English gold to dissolve their own parliament. Scotland lost her voice, more or less, in 1707 with the union of the parliaments. The parliament hadn't been in Edinburgh for hundreds of years, but that was now vacant. Everybody had to go down to Westminster in London, and there they sat. And many Scots were not at all happy with that, especially the Highlanders, and many of who lived along the coast, who made their money from trade with France, didn't want to be, or Spain, didn't want to be bothered with customs and duties and all those kinds of things. They became almost overnight known as smugglers. All of a sudden, they were on the wrong side of the law. They didn't care much for the union. Well, James, the 8th and 3rd, over there in France, realized there was great discontent in Scotland. He thought this was the perfect time to strike. So the King of France arranged a bunch of ships. He sailed over, got to sea, almost could touch Scotland. He could almost reach it. Unfortunately, the Admiral spied some English ships preventing their landing in Scotland. And so James, while he pleaded, please let me land, please let me see my people, the French admiral said, no, I'm sorry, I've got to take care of your person. We're going back to France. James was more morose than ever. He was from the Stuarts. If you look at all their pictures, they all had longish faces, very morose-looking race of people, the Stuarts were. At this point, he became very desperate. That was 1708. Made his way back to France. You have to understand something about France. France was always looking for an opportunity to give the English throne a bit of a wobble. And it's been said that they used the Stuarts as a pawn, a diversion from the continental wars, where England had so many of her armies over there. They had to bring their armies back every time there was one of these risings. France kind of used the Stuarts for that, but the Stuarts were always hoping against hope that one day they would regain their ancient throne. But 1708 led to absolutely nothing. James went back to France. In 1714, his sister Anne finally died. Now, Anne, much like her sister Mary, survived all of her children. None of her children were still alive when she finally passed away in 1714. She had outlived them all. And there was a bit of a succession crisis. However, the British, and by this time we can call that whole island Great Britain, because when the union of the parliaments took place in 1707, then Scotland and England became Great Britain, along with Wales there and Cornwall and the rest. But it was now called Great Britain. the people of Great Britain were ever becoming more and more Protestant. James was very much a Catholic. Those two things didn't go very well, but the French were always willing to use the Stuarts. By this time, in 1714, when Anne passed away, there was a gentleman in her government, a Tory, whose name was John the Earl of Mar, and John Graham, the Earl of Mar, and he made his way back to Scotland after the brand new prince, who was Georg of Hanover, made his way to England. How did that happen? How did that happen? Well, he was the closest Stuart blood relative in the royal line across Europe who was not a Catholic. Believe it or not, Georg I, George I, came from Hanover, way over, couldn't speak a word of English, didn't care for the English, didn't like their food, didn't like their castles, didn't like their horses, didn't like their fashions, yet he was a Protestant. And that's why they brought him over. He was a Lutheran at that, was not an Anglican, but they were going to try to change that generationally. Once again, the Scots were very upset that there was someone other than a Scot, other than a Stuart, sitting on the throne. So what did they do? The Earl of Mar made his way up to the Highlands of Scotland, to Braemar, raised 10,000 men at one point, 10,000 men, huge Jacobite army. And they were going to try to regain the throne of Great Britain by this time for James over there in exile. And they had one great battle under the Earl of Mar. That was the Battle of Sherimuir. And it was sort of a tie, but the Earl of Mar had so many more men. He could have won, he could have beat the Argyll, but he didn't take the advantage. He didn't follow up the second day, and he could have done that. Had he done that, he might have won. Instead, he and his great Highland clans went north once again, and the Duke of Argyll called for reinforcements from England, from the lowlands of Scotland, horse, men, muskets, powder, cannon, mortar, all of that. And they brought that north. And by the time James came over from France to Scotland in December of that year, 1750, it was all over. And the Earl of Mar said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I guess we'll have to go." And James lingered for a month, and he decided to go back to France. And this third rising, 1688 to 89, 1708, nowhere at 1715, was another bust, and James became more morose than ever. But another generation of Scots rose for him. Many of the Scots were still loyal to the exiled Stuarts.
Where, tell me where, is your Highland laddie gone? Where, tell me where, is your Highland laddie gone? He's gone with streaming banners where noble deeds are done, and it's so in my head I wish him safe at home. And what, tell me what, did your Highland laddie wear? What, tell me what, did your Highland laddie wear? A bonnet with a lofty plume, and on his breast a plaid, and it's so in my head I loom my Highland lad. And what, tell me what, if your Highland lad be slain? What, tell me what, if your Highland lad be slain? Oh no, true love will be his God and bring him safe again, for it's so my heart would brag if my Highland lad were slain. And where, tell me where, did your Highland laddie dwell? Where, tell me where, did your Hieland laddie dwell? He dwelt in bonny Scotland, where blooms the sweet bluebell, and it's so in my heart I lue my laddie well. Oh, where
another generation rose for the Stuarts. There was one more rising in James VIII and III, and that was in 1719, just a few years after 1715. That was more or less a rebellion of some Highlanders and a lot of Spanish troops. If you've ever been to Eilean Castle, which I believe in your time is one of the most beautiful castles ever, and perhaps one of the most painted and captured castles, you might go there next time you go to Scotland and visit its beauty. Right near Eilean was where much of the action took place, and Glen Shiel as well. But it was a bit of a bust. Once again, the Highlanders were too disorganized. They didn't organize well enough, and the government troops came in and took care of the whole thing in just a day or two. Eilean Castle, back in those days, 1719, looked very different from what you can see today. But it was filled with gunpowder after the rising and blown sky high. And the rocks and the bricks and the mortar and everything came crashing down in a giant pile. It was a man later in generations who rebuilt Eilean Castle into what you see today. But at the heart of that castle is an old castle that was part of that rising in 1719. Well, at this time, James was more or less giving up on winning the throne back for himself by this time. His father was long since gone. He got married very close to the time that we're talking about in 1719. Married to a lovely young lady who was to give him 2 sons. And you might have heard of both of them. You especially have heard of the first. His name was Charles Edward Stuart. Have you heard of bonny Prince Charlie before? I bet you have. He's one of the most famous Scots in all of history. One of the most painted. And if you go to Scotland today and you pick up a tin of Scottish shortbread, if you see a handsome young lad on that tin of shortbread, chances are good that it's bonny Prince Charlie. And if you ever want to know anything about the Jacobite Risings at all, chances are you want to know about the bonny Prince and Culloden Moor, where it all fell apart in the Highlands of Scotland, April 16th, 1746. If you ask me now of Culloden Moor, the sadness o'er the field, and the haunting lilt to the piper's score for the men who never would yield, when you ask of the stories that speak of those who died in Shirley's cause and risked and gave it all to fate to extinguish English laws, well, I tell you now, there was a time when this country was our own, when Scotland was for brother Scots, since Bruce had graced the throne. But the years came crumbling down the walls, and the cold winds washed away, and our freedoms sold for title and gold by a parcel of rogues were they. And on they marched, one by one, the Highlanders, take a Loddon's drum, we claim our targe and musket gun in the midst of morning grey. And on they marched, 2 by 2, tramping the heather in foggy dew, the men who only victory knew until that fateful day. We thought that hope and all was lost until a news did come of a high prince born in Italy, a royal Scottish son. We pinned our hopes and prayed 'twas true, we prayed with many a tear that victory would come with a sword of the brave young chevalier. And on they marched, one by one, the Highlanders, take a Loddon's drum, we claim our targe and musket gun in the midst of morning grey. And on they marched, 2 by 2, tramping the heather in foggy dew, the men who only victory knew until that fateful day. For 9 lang months he led our men who longed to win the crown. For he who lifted up our hopes and threw our shackles down, he promised battle, promised fame, promised God would be all on our side if we would fight to win back our country. And on they marched one by one, the Highlanders, take a Lawton's drum. We claim our targe and musket gun in the midst of morning grey. And on they marched two by two, tramping the heather and foggy dew, the men who only victory knew until that fateful day. And then the month of April came, and the ragged lot were we, half starved, nearly frozen, when we met the King's army. The battle lasted just an hour, and then the killings came. The butcher crushed the very floor of Scotland's youth in shame. But now the battle's o'er. There's quiet in the glen. The mighty stones mark final rest of bonny Charlie's men. But sometimes, when the wind is richt, you can hear them marching still to win back Scottish freedom and victory fulfill. And on they marched one by one, the Highlanders, take a Lawton's drum. We claim our targe and musket gun in the midst of morning grey. Forever they'll march two by two, tramping the heather and foggy dew. The men who only victory knew will never fade away, will never fade away, will never fade away. For the next little while, we'll be talking about bonny Prince Charlie. And I'll have you understand, if you are a fan of your television and you've seen the bonny prince in certain television programs that show him as a man who's a little bit of a less than charismatic man, let me say, that was not the prince that I knew. The prince that I knew was very charismatic, very athletic, the best dancer, the best horseman, the best shot. He could sing and dance. He knew 4 languages, and he was every inch of him was a prince. In fact, one of the best princes in all of Europe, if you were to ask me. That's why I and 6 other companions, later known as the 7 Men of Moidart, risked everything, indeed our very lives and our fortunes, what we had, for this bonny prince who was trying to win back the throne of all of Great Britain for his exiled father. Now it was his time to fight the forces of the government. Now Charles was born in your time, would have been New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1720. And he was born in Rome. After all, in 1716, James had to leave France for good, forever, because the English and the French signed a treaty that kicked the Stuarts out of all French dominions. So he became a guest of the Pope, and therefore, because he was a guest of the Pope, was even less likely to be invited back to England to rule over the English, let alone the Scots. And Charles had a younger brother named Henry. Those are the 2 sons that James VIII and III and his wife had. The Stuarts were all but forgotten until 1720, when Charles Edward Stuart, his full name was Charles Edward Louis John Casimir Sylvester Severino Maria Stuart, was born. And they say that when he was born, there was a brand new star in the sky and a storm raged over Hanover. He was to raise the Highland clans in 1745. The last part of our program today will have to do with the bonny prince and the Jacobite Risings of 1745 to 46.
Sound the pibroch loud and high, great John across to the Highland sky. Let all the clans their slogans cry, rise and follow Charlie. A cheen foam, 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 a cheen foam, 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 a cheen gathering fast, the loyal men, they grasp their dirks and shout again, hurrah for Royal Charlie. A cheen foam, 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 a cheen foam, 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 a cheen foam, 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 rise and follow Charlie. On dark Culloden's field of gore, hark, hark, they shout, Claymore, Claymore. They bravely fight, what can they more? They fight and die for Shirley. A-cheen, foam, 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 a-cheen, foam, 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 a-cheen, foam, foam, foam. Never see their deeds again. Deserted is each Highland glen, with lonely cares o'er all the men who fought and died for Charlie. A-cheen, foam, 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 a-cheen, foam, 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 a-cheen, foam, foam, foam. Rise and follow Charlie. Rise and follow Charlie. Rise and follow Charlie.
So we enter the last chapter, the beginning of the end of the Jacobite Risings. Bonnie Prince Charlie had been in contact with various men from Rome. They made their way all the way to Italy to talk to him, to talk to his father about perhaps another rising. But they were all very factious, and the Jacobites who remembered the older days were at this point very, very long in the tooth indeed, if they were even still alive. Very few men remembered the rising of 1689 all the way in 1744 or 45. But Charles was raised with one notion in mind, and that was to win back the throne of all of Great Britain for his father, James VIII and III. As a result of that, all of his training was martial. He learned how to shoot and how to ride. He saw battle. Actually did, as a very, very young man. He was every inch the soldier, a bonniest prince you've ever seen, and he was ready for action. So when Louis XV wrote him in 1744 and said, come on over, we'll put you on a boat with thousands of other soldiers, you'll land in Great Britain, and you'll take back the throne for your father, Charles jumped at the chance. He made his way in incognito, in disguise, all the way from Rome till he made it to France. And there was a great navy, French navy, waiting for their action against the coast of Great Britain. The French and the English had been fighting each other since the dawn of time. This was just another day as far as Louis, King Louis, was concerned. But for Charles, it was everything. He knew that if he landed in Scotland or in England, the Jacobites that he had heard of so much growing up would rise for him. After all, he was raised with these great romantic notions that people still longed for him in Scotland and in England and in Wales and also in Ireland. And he wanted to fulfill his destiny, which was to put his father back on the ancient throne of the Stuarts. So he left his father, 1744. He was to never see his father again. He said to his father, I choose to bring you back 3 crowns, that of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And if he failed in the attempt, the next sight you'll see of him will be in his coffin. James very much loved Charles and was heartbroken that his son would leave. He was so worried that something would happen to him. After all, James didn't have a lot of luck in his lifetime. He was worried that Charles would be much the same. Charles landed in France, but the French ships were pushed back by a Protestant wind, they said, pushed back against the shore. Hundreds of men died. They perished in the waves. The boats were capsized. The horses drowned. The entire thing was scuttled in a matter of hours. And Louis said, "That's it, I'm done. I'm not going to do anything more for you, Charles. I suggest you find your way back to Rome." But Charles did not come all that way to turn back now. So he stayed in France. He pawned his mother's jewels, and he raised various men who were willing to fight for him. And he got 2 ships. The Elizabeth, which was a captured British man of war, which was more or less lent to him with a wink and a nod from the king. On that were 100 men, Irishmen, in the service of France, the Irish Brigade. You might have heard that name before. And on it were 1,500 muskets and 1,800 broadswords and lots of French gold to fund the mission. And Charles was on a smaller ship, a frigate, a 16-gun ship called the Dutale. And they set sail from France in early July, and they were going to make their way all the way to the Western Isles of Scotland. Way out, if you look at the map of Scotland, the Western Isles are as far west as you can go. That's where the Jacobite heritage was. That's where he would find an army willing to fight for him. After all, they said in 1740, as they signed an association, that if he came over with French money and French troops, they would rise for him in the Highlands of Scotland and win back at least the throne of Scotland for him and for his father. So he set sail with 100 Irish volunteers, various French troops as well, and Charles was on the smaller ship, the Dutale. They weren't out too long until the HMS Lions, a British man of war, 60 or 61 guns, I suppose, about the same size as the Elizabeth. They met each other in the open sea, broadside to broadside. They fired at each other for hours on end until the evening. And the only thing that prevented them from fighting further was the darkness that set on. It's amazing that neither ship sank, but neither ship was no longer seaworthy. Charles watched the entire battle from the Dutale. He was helpless. He wanted the pilot of the Dutale to bring them closer. Maybe they could help out the Elizabeth in this hour of need. But the Dutale was to go nowhere near there. Bonnie Prince Charlie was the most precious cargo on the face of the planet at that time. He was not going, the pilot of the boat was not going to sacrifice Charlie for this cause, even though Charlie wanted to fight. And there was a bit of a council between the men of the Elizabeth and the Dutale, and the HMS Lion creaked and groaned and moaned its way back to England, out of sight. But surely the HMS Lions told the other ships that there was some French activity, and everybody knew that. So they had to make a decision and make it fast what they were going to do. Some people suggested that the Bonnie Prince go back to France, get another boat, get more guns, more weapons, more soldiers, etc. Bonnie Prince Charlie said, "I'm sorry, I can't turn back now. We've got the Dutale, we've got 16 guns, I've got some muskets, some broadswords, I've got some cannon, I've got some gold. We'll make a go for it." We kind of looked at each other, because I and the 6 other gentlemen that came with me, later known as the 7 Men of Moidart, I told you about them, we're kind of worried about our chances at this point. There we are, without the great Elizabeth with us. In fact, we would be all alone, making our way to the Highlands. But no one was going to contradict Prince Charles at this juncture. So we said goodbye to the Elizabeth, and we made our way for the Outer Hebrides. We landed on a little island called Eriskay, July 23rd. We made our way to the mainland of Scotland, and all the Scots that we met along the way said, "Oh, so I see you've come, but where are all the French troops that you said you'd bring for us? Where is all the money? Where's all the broadswords? Where's the muskets? We told you we would help you if you brought those things. Where are they? Perhaps you should go back home." Prince Charlie said, "I have come home, sir, and I will entertain no notion of returning whence I came. I have every trust that my gallant Highlanders will stand by me." It was argument after argument. Very few clan chiefs were willing to rise for him. And in one particular discussion, the Bonnie Prince was outnumbered once again. He looked around the room, taking the size and measure of every man, and he saw a young man. It was young Ranald MacDonald, grasping his sword as I am now, and he was very anxious. He was very nervous. He wanted to say something. And the bonny prince could sense him, and he said, "You, sir, will you rise for me? Will you rise for your prince?" And young Ranald said, I will. Though no other man in the Highlands is willing to raise a sword for you, I am willing to die for you." And the bonny prince knew there was hope yet. He sent another few letters out. He knew he had to meet one fellow named Donald Cameron, the gentle Lochiel, the chief of Clan Cameron. He knew that if he could convince him, he could win this whole day. Well, Donald Cameron's brother said to him, "Look, if you're going to meet the prince, you've got to be careful. He will turn your mind. I know you've said you don't want to rise for him or take the Camerons with you, but that prince is a very charismatic young man." And Donald Cameron said, don't worry. I won't let him change my mind. I'm not going to rise for him. He doesn't have the French troops. I and all the Highland clans are going to stay home and sit this one out. We remember what happened in 1719. We remember what happened in 1715. We certainly remember what happened in 1689. We're not going to rise. So very soon he met up with the bonny prince, and the prince said, "Are you willing to rise for me?" He said, "No, sir, I'm not. You don't have the French ships. You don't have the money. You don't have the men." And the bonny prince by this time was very upset, but he understood men. He understood people, just as he understood young Ranald. And he said, after he turned his back on the gentle Lochiel, he said, "Very well, you shall read of the fate of your prince in the newspapers." Well, that pricked the Highland honor of Donald Cameron. And he got on one knee and he said, "I shall share the fate of my prince, and so shall every man over whom God and nature has given me power." And so August 19th, the bonny prince, I, and the other men, the 7 men of Moidart, and several others, were at Glenshiel, way up there in the Highlands of Scotland. And we waited all morning long for Donald Cameron and various MacDonalds. Noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, where were they? We were all getting very anxious. They said they would rise. Eventually we heard the skirl of the pipes. And it was the Camerons coming, 700, 800 strong, followed by MacDonald of Keppoch and various other MacDonalds, and the rising was on. Well, there was a lot of work to be done. It's one thing to have an army of 1,200, 1,300 men way up there in the remote Highlands of Scotland. It's quite another to have a brand new golden crown upon your head. The bonny prince knew his next stop had to be Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh is a beautiful old city. Perhaps you've been there. The capital of Scotland. There's no other city like it in the world. Now, Edinburgh, as I've mentioned before, they dissolved their parliament. There had been no royals visiting Edinburgh since the time of James VII, when he was Duke of York, back in the time of Charles II. This goes back generations. Edinburgh is a beautiful royal burg with no royalty. So when Charlie wanted to take it, I got to tell you, the emotions were mixed. Many people held Jacobite sympathies in their heart. They wanted to rise. They wanted to open the gates of the city. Many more said, no, we can't do that. That's going to really upset London. The negotiations went back and forth between bonny Prince Charlie and the men inside the gated city of Edinburgh until one night, it was the 16th going into the 17th of September, just a few weeks after the rising at Glenshiel. The port was left open as a carriage went back out after depositing the negotiators inside the city. And Donald Cameron and his Lochiel, Donald Cameron and all of his Camerons swept into the city, quiet like the wind. Not a shot was fired. And the very next morning, September 17th, when everybody woke up in Edinburgh, there were Highlanders at every port. It was again a Jacobite tune. But that was not the beginning. Charlie had so much more to do before that. It's one thing to have Edinburgh, but he wanted London. The army of Johnny Cope was making its way down from the Highlands of Scotland. Now, Johnny Cope was an older government soldier, and he had very young recruits with him. They were no match for the Highland army that bonny Prince Charlie had. Provisioned poorly though they were, and they had one battle. It was the Battle of Preston Pans, September 21st. Once again, the Highland charge won the day, and in 20 minutes, Johnny Cope's army was destroyed. Hundreds of men were killed, hundreds were taken prisoner, and the bonny prince came back to Edinburgh, and everybody, especially the ladies, loved him. But he wasn't going to stay for very long. November 4th, he left Edinburgh. After so many councils of war, they decided they were going to try to take London. By this time, as nothing breeds success like success, their numbers had swelled to about 5,000 men. They crossed over into England on November 8th. And several days later, they were at the castle of Carlisle in the north of England, which eventually fell for the prince. Not only did they take the city of Carlisle, they took the castle as well, which they could never do in Edinburgh. While they took the town, they couldn't take that beautiful castle, which was almost impossible to take, unless it wants to be taken, on the top of that hill, on top of Castle Rock. But they took Carlisle, the city, and the castle in England, in enemy territory. Well, again, they started their march south again. But the Jacobites in England were not rising for the bonny prince as he promised. He landed in Manchester, raised 300 soldiers. They called them the Manchester Regiment. But there still wasn't enough. We marched all the way down to Derby on December 4th. That's where we arrived at Derby. 120 miles from London. But where were all the English Jacobites we'd heard about? There was a council of war on December 5th, and Lord George Murray, who was the most able of all of Bonnie Prince Charlie's generals, said, "Your Highness, I've spoken with the clan chiefs. I've spoken with General O'Sullivan. I've spoken with Sir John MacDonald. I've spoken with many other soldiers here, and we don't feel, Your Highness, that we can go any further. We haven't seen any French troops. We haven't seen any English Jacobites rise for us, as you said they would. We suggest we go back to Scotland, we winter there, and we have a brand new rising in the spring of the next year, 1746. Bonnie Prince Charlie could not understand what he was hearing. He says, "Has it come to this?" But he was outvoted. George Murray had an excellent point. We are so far down in enemy territory, and there were 3 armies after us, or so we heard. If we were flanked, or if they covered our tracks, we couldn't get back to Scotland. So we had to go back. And no army on the face of the planet could move as fast as the Highland army could. We weren't all bogged down with great cattle trains and so forth. So we made incredible time going back into Scotland. And really, it was a long, long march to Culloden from that point on. We had a couple of victories. We had the victory of Clifton Moor in December of 1745. We had Falkirk Moor, another great Jacobite victory in January of 1746. But the great victory we so desperately needed eluded us. We are running out of gold. We are running out of men. Many of the men decided to just go back home, where they came from. They were marching all this way. They took their booty and they made it back to their Highland fastnesses until April 16th came. Culloden is a moor, and it rolls across several hundred yards of Highland ground. And it's boggy here and it's rocky there. And that was the land that was chosen for what was to become the last stand of the Jacobites in 1746. The night before, on April 15th, the Duke of Cumberland, the king's second son, who had been called over from Europe with 12,000 men serving under the king of England and Scotland, George II by this point, Georg II, as they would call him back in Hanover. The Duke of Cumberland came with his army and his tactics, and he followed the prince very slowly up to the Highlands of Scotland, and at Nairn, only a few miles away from Culloden, there he rested on the 15th and celebrated his birthday. And the bonny prince, I and many others, were hoping that he and his soldiers were enjoying some fine scotch or brandy or whatever to celebrate the king's the prince's birthday. And we tried a night march. We marched several miles to try to surprise them at Nairn. But before long, the dawn was coming, and we were nowhere near where we had to be. And we went all the way back to Culloden, and we were exhausted. We were hungry. The men were half starved, and they were in no condition to fight the very next day. Yet, like a great crimson river, the forces under the Duke of Cumberland came to Culloden Moor. You had their horse, the dragoons, you had the redcoats of the army, you had the cannons, you had all the regular foot, about 10,000. On the other side of the field were about half their number, bonny Prince Charlie's men who were half-starved. Many were still asleep. Many were miles away looking for food. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Highlanders were soundly defeated. And that was it for the Bonnie Prince. He made his way out the back. I never saw him again. I went to Inverness with so many others and was captured and was later traded as a prisoner of war. There were two men who fought with the Bonnie Prince in his army, two Highlanders. And they swore to one another that one way or another they would return home to Scotland, as so many hundreds were taken south to stand trial, to be hanged. 120 were butchered in their treasonous gore. Hundreds more were to be sent to the colonies as slaves. But these two men were in the castle of Carlisle. They swore to each other that one way or another they would return back home to Scotland. And in the bowels of Carlisle Castle, where they were tried, it is said that they sang to each other this song. Perhaps you've heard it before. I'll sing it for you now, and sing it for yourselves at home, wherever you are. By yon bonny banks, by yon bonny braes, where the sun shines bright, on Loch Lomond, where me and my true love will ever want to gaze, on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Do you know this? Ye'll tak the high road, I'll tak the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye, for me and my true love will never meet again, on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. It was there that we parted in yon shady glen, on the steep, steep side of Ben Lomond, where in purple hue the Highland hills we viewed, and the moon coming out in the gloam. And sing it with me now. Ye'll tak the high road, I'll tak the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye, for me and my true love will never meet again, on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Well, one of those fellows was allowed to walk back home to Scotland. The other fellow was condemned to die for treason. And the Bonnie Prince was on the run. 30,000 pounds were put on his head, an incredible bounty, 30,000 pounds, which is about 50 million of your dollars today, on his head, if anybody would bring him in, dead or alive. Nobody did. Many knew exactly where he was from April 16th until he eventually caught a ship for France in September. And he was in the Highlands and in the islands of Scotland, always just an hour or two in front of the red coats of the government army or the black coats of the government militia. Many took him in. Many sheltered him, gave him food. After all, he was their prince. Even if they were paid by the Hanoverian government, he was a sentimental value to them, the Bonnie Prince Charlie. I'll leave you with a note of one young lady that you might have heard of, who rescued the prince in his hour of need. Her name was Flora MacDonald. At this time, in June of 1746, the prince was hiding among the rocks and the foxes of the Outer Hebrides, that long island way out there in the Atlantic. And a young man appealed to Flora MacDonald to ferry him over, to sail him from Benbecula, the little island in between the Uists, North and South Uist, to Isle of Skye, where she was from. At first, she said she didn't want anything to do with it. But then he appealed to her sense of Highland honor. The king was in distress. Highland hospitality dictated that she help him. Very well, she said. Her father, her stepfather, after all, was a local captain of a militia, Hugh MacDonald. She got a pass from him, and most likely he knew everything that was going on. But Flora MacDonald said she had a spinster named Betty Burke, an Irish spinster, that she had to ferry from Benbecula back to Skye for work to spin over there on the Isle of Skye. She got a pass for him. Now, the bonny prince, who was every inch 5'11", looked like a very ungainly female, but nevertheless he had on this dress, and with a wink and a nod, Hugh MacDonald let them get on that boat, make it to the Isle of Skye. It's one of the most famous boat rides in all of British history, if not the history of the world. And perhaps when you were young, your granny sang this song to you. It tells the story of Flora MacDonald and the bonny prince and 5 or 6 rowers going from Uist to the Isle of Skye in the dark of night to save the bonny prince just for one more hour. The song is called the Skye Boat Song. Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad who was born to be king over the sea to Skye. Though the waves leap, soft shall ye sleep, ocean's a royal bed. Rocked in the deep, Flora will keep watch o'er your weary head. Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on a wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad who is born to be king over the sea to Skye, over the sea to Skye. Well, the bonny prince was not out of harm's way yet. It was only June 27th. He was to live in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland until September, till he finally caught a boat for France. Young Flora MacDonald was scooped up as they scooped up all the Jacobites, taken down to London as so many had to go, and she was going to be tried for her crimes of treason. But she was such a bonny lass and such great character, they didn't dare touch a hair on her head. And the bonny prince grew a long beard and was thin and was sick, was not in good health. And there he was, carried by various Highlanders who took him under their wing until he finally caught a ship for France. He would never see Scotland again when he bid farewell on the western coast, very close to where he landed in July of the previous year. The Jacobite days are come and gone. The war cries are nae mair. The clansman's life and battles past, but stories that we share. But the tour, marking the dark loch shield, reminds us so the day when the Gaelic heart beats strong and true for the ancient Highland way. Those centuries divide us frae we who came before and left our blood upon the field where Charlie's dreams would fall. But honour is a timeless trait, and those who bore it knew their deeds would live forever, though they sleep beneath the dew. And sleep they will, while we who know their stories live to tell of the bravery of Murray and Lochiel, yes, all too well. Their likes will ne'er come again. Their cause lives on in song of returning to the rightful throne, a king gane far too long. So as the white rose ever blooms, their dreams will never die. O Scotland, oh, and for the Scots, frae Tweed to Orkney's sky. Remember those like Flora fair, who risked it all that day, for a prince and all he stood for, that dream won't fade away. ladies and gentlemen, I've come to the end of my time with you. I can tell you that Flora MacDonald will be forever remembered in the great pantheon of Jacobite heroes and heroines for risking her very life for her prince. Lord George Murray, the prince's most able general, escaped to Holland. He was to die in exile. John O'Sullivan was to make it to France. He would serve in the French service once again. He would marry and marry well. The Duke of Perth was to die at the Tower of London. The Duke of Atholl, excuse me. And I was taken at Inverness. I was eventually traded, as I was in the service of France, traded for English prisoners in France. And if you were to be in an old Scottish pub somewhere in the Highlands tonight, and you saw an old man over there in the corner singing to himself, and you overheard a word or two, perhaps it was a song that his granny sang to him when he was just a wee bairn, a wee little laddie. It's an old lament. Bonnie Cherries knew a war safely o'er the friendly main. Money's the head will break in twa, should he ne'er come back again. Will ye now come back again? Will ye now come back again? Better lewd ye canna be. Will ye now come back again? English bribes were all in vain, though poor and poorer we may be. Silver cannot buy the head that I beat sworn for thine and thee. Will ye now come back again? Will ye now come back again? Better you canna be. Will ye now come back again? Will ye now come back again? Let's sing this one more time. You'll take the high road, I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye. For me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. On the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. On the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for letting me speak to you for the last little while. Remember the bonny prince, remember what he stood for, and I look forward to one day singing more songs with you about the bonny prince and the Jacobite Risings. Good night.